And it is my great privilege and honor to welcome you this evening to our lecture. And as I was walking into my office this morning trying to think about what I was going to say, because so many of you are repeat offenders that you're probably bored of what I usually say, my eyes lit upon a bumper sticker on my door that says, well-behaved women rarely make history, which I'm sure this crowd has heard before. Reif, who, as far as I can tell, was not a particularly well-behaved woman. And this series was put together by her friends and colleagues, a whole bunch of not particularly well-behaved women. And the way that we celebrate this not particularly well-behaved women is to invite a whole series of, as far as we can tell, not particularly well-behaved women to instill in us almost a sense of outrage as to why we need to continue being as poorly behaved as we are. So as somebody who benefited from the not well-behaved women before me, and who I try and instill in my students to not be well-behaved, I think this evening let us celebrate bad behavior in women. And I will turn the podium over to Stephanie, who is going to...
Ann Heyman.
Oh, Ann Heyman. Oh, I'm sorry. I was told Stephanie.
You were, I admit that.
I was told Stephanie. I'm handing it over to Ann Heyman, who's going to introduce the video first.
This is how horrible rumors get.
Let's see. She's not going to behave. As we all know.
Sorry.
All right, good evening. How many of you knew Pat? Oh my God. Oh, the legacy lives. All right, that's impressive. But I am indeed Ann Heyman, and it is wonderful to be here with me this evening. I believe it was about 1982. I was maybe 2 years into a fledgling ministry with prostituted women here in Los Angeles, and the patriarchal concepts that I had arrived at this avocation with were starting to just crumble into little pieces, as you can well imagine. And my friend Bear, is she here yet?
Yes.
Yay! All right. My friend Bear happened to mention to me that Pat Reif was starting a program, a master's degree in feminist spirituality and immaculate heart. And I just thought, oh my God, this is an answer to prayer. So Bear and I made an appointment to go see Pat, and I mean, it was an answer to prayer. It was sitting at the feet of leading feminist theologians from around the world for a weekend, 3 or 4 times a year. Oh, it couldn't have been any better. And it certainly did help make sense out of my rather crazy life at that point in time, particularly learning to trust women's experience. It was phenomenal. It really was. Bless her heart, Pat called me back into her office in 1992 and told me I had to finish the program. She absolutely insisted I graduate. She said I could come back and take classes, but I did have to finish the program. So it was kind of my lifeline throughout those 10 years, I guess. Pat was just an incredible woman. I mean, I don't think she ever met a protester she didn't like. She'd go to jail for that. I never got to visit her in jail. I always regretted that. I thought it would have been a great experience. But she was phenomenal. And I remember her playing tennis. She absolutely loved tennis. She played 2 or 3 times a week if she could find somebody to play with. And the other thing that I really admired about Pat was that she stopped smoking. And she would have told you it was probably one of the hardest things she ever did. It's a horrible addiction to break, it really is. And she did it. And it took her several tries, and I tried to offer her as much moral support during this process as I could, but she eventually was able to do that. And I think if she were here today, she would tell you that was one of the greatest achievements, perhaps, of her life, was her ability to, and she was a heavy smoker, so it was a real challenge for her. Anyway, she left us with a wonderful legacy, a program that has never been equal that I know of anywhere in the world, and her heart was always in the right place, and she was a not well-behaved woman. She really did take risks and did do things that were not, especially a woman religious, were just not anticipated that she would do some of the things that she did. So anyway, we have a video. I invite you to watch it, and then I believe someone will introduce Lisa. Is that you? Karen. All right. Thank you.
seamless person in terms of her work and her life.
So Pat has been, for me, one of the most important influences in my life. Pat Reif, of course, is an old friend of mine. I know her back from when she was teaching at a college in the 60s.
She was a great friend and mentor and a wonderful colleague in the field of feminist studies and religion.
She embodied excellence in everything she did. She had just been a woman ahead of her time. Professor in philosophy, and having not had a lot of exposure to such a topic, except in religion to some extent, I was very, she stretched your mind. She would never let me stay anymore. You had to go to another level.
Pat was one of those inveterate organizers who was always able to find a way, whether it was to get resources together, to raise money, to bring people together. And she was a very, very important person.
Anger at the bonds of injustice. Like prophets before her, Pat worked tirelessly all of her life to loosen those bonds of injustice.
Long before it was popular to be with the farm workers and the people who were immigrants in California, long before it was popular to be on a picket line or to be opposing a war here or there that the U.S. was waging, Pat Reif was there. Feminist Christology. And that was a very important program. She headed that. I don't remember now how many years, but certainly a number of years. And I used to teach for that. So I would come out from, I guess, Chicago was where I was at that point. And I would give, let's say, weekend intensive or something like that. And she, I think, was a very important program because many, many people went through it. they were really shaped by that program for an ongoing career in issues about women and social justice. And so I think that program, Feminist Christology, and all the people who went through it and who carried on that legacy in their own lives, is her major legacy in that area.
Pat was tireless in her work for that program. She came to visit me at Water to look at bibliography and to talk about the kinds of people who would be useful as mentors and professors in that.
But the Feminist Spirituality program was the outgrowth of a major conversion to feminism that Pat had experienced. The material was no longer just an intellectual discipline. Now it was a matter of life and death for women. She had suddenly understood the connection between the patriarchal system and the oppression of women and many men and the earth itself. And it was her mission to undo the patriarchal system. Feminist theologians and ethicists of the day to show that feminism was way beyond women gaining equal access to men, getting equal pay for equal work, etc. It was about having a broad enough perspective so that one is aware that everyone suffers in a patriarchal system and that any oppression is immoral.
I stayed with Pat a few times here when she moved into Pilgrim Place. And then I was teaching up at the GTU in Berkeley when I heard that she began to suffer from this illness, which of course really brought her life to an end all too swiftly. And at one point I called her up, we were talking over the phone, and she said to me in such a kind of poignant voice, something like, "I'm just not ready to leave this beautiful world." And so I just remember her voice. I can almost hear it in my head, her voice saying that. I'm just not ready to leave this beautiful world. And that was a very poignant moment that I think about when I think about Pat Reif.
We honor you, our most beloved sister, for a race well run to the end, and in the midst of our sorrow at your loss, we trust that although you are not where you were before, you are now wherever we are.
was Pat Reif, who was an inspiration also for us here in Claremont as we started the MA in Women's Studies and Religion and then later the PhD in Women's Studies and Religion. And it was because we had taken up that legacy of Pat Reif's that the Immaculate Heart community sat down with us and said, let's co-sponsor a lectureship in her honor. And I'm Karen Torgeson, and then started the Women's Studies and Religion program and was part of those early wonderful negotiations that have begun these lifelong, I think, relationships. So it's very exciting to have this year as our Pat Reif lecturer, Lisa Isherwood. Lisa comes to us from England. She has a long history there. I had not met her until today, which is just terrifically exciting because I have known of her work for so long, and her work has been very influential for the students in the program. So this was a gift to them also to have her here. Lisa is fundamentally a theologian, profoundly a theologian, and because she is profoundly a theologian, she's also profoundly an ethicist. And as she began her own intellectual journey, it was grappling with who the figure was on the cross. And that began her investigations into feminist theology, then liberation theology. And she has been a thinker who, without really very much visible support, I think that's what makes your journey, I think, most dramatic, is there's not as much the large community around of people who are doing the kind of work that you've been doing. So she's been doing groundbreaking work ever since she started. So as soon as the ground is broken, she keeps moving on to break new ground. Wow. So that's led her to create space for new ways of thinking about fundamental issues related to embodiment, related to our being in the world, being in time, being in flesh, being material. So that has brought her to the issues of sexuality and gender. That has brought her to the questions of the way we think about animals. It has brought her to questions about how we think about the human body. I think the most dramatic title you have, and they're not undramatic, but The Fat Jesus is one of her more recent books. So she will think deeply, theologically and ethically, from this perspective of feminist theology and embodiment about all of the issues that stand in front of her in contemporary society. So her primary role as a thinker is really better underscored as the role of a prophet. She has, I'll give you some of her titles: The Power of Erotic Celibacy, Liberating Christ, Patriarchs, Prophets, and Other Villains, Radical Otherness, a Theological Social Investigation, and the question she's taking on now is cosmology itself, a radical cosmology. The Poverty of Orthodoxy. She and Rosemary started a early series on gender and violence. She started a series on sexuality and the body, and we're very proud to have one of our graduates who published in that series, and Lisa was an editor for her. So you need to hear from her, not me, about her. So let me invite her to come and speak with you. Lisa, welcome.
Well, good heavens. Good evening. How's everybody? You okay? Mm-hmm. Thank you for being here. I was going to say at the beginning of this that I want to thank Karen and the committee, and I truly do. But I also, before I saw that little film, wanted to say, I'm kind of honoured to be here for this lecture, which I am, but I'm now extremely humbled and feel that there's not very much I can say after all that Pat Reif did and said and was. So I'll do my best, but it seems an even bigger task than it was at first. So thank you, everybody, and here we go. As Karen said, but I still think I need to come clean about it at the start, I'm a feminist liberation theologian, and at this moment I find queer theory and queer theology helps with the questions that feminism has grappled with and has found gaps and spaces in. So I think queer theory helps those gaps and helps those spaces. It's, in my view, a way that we can engage with these untidy edges, because it enjoys that. It enjoys getting the bits that don't fit. Should have done that. And through trespassing, transgressing, through mining submerged knowledges, queering attempts to change the way we see, and most importantly, the way we act. It is fundamentally a refusal to be normalised into oblivion through the deadening systems of a binary opposite world. It is a contradiction, and it's a fluid revolution. To my mind, then, it's a way of expressing theologically, and one that can expand and make more glorious our incarnational being. Further, of course, I think it takes on one of the most useful tools of feminist theology, that of imagination. It's unconstrained by convention, and it allows for exploration of all the edgy questions, the dark corners of theology and human existence, and it doesn't begin with the expectation that there will be any correct answers. It doesn't have to find creedal answers, it doesn't have to stay within current theological systems, so it's as frightening as hell, but it's also very freeing. Many have spoken of the courage that it takes, and I think they're not wrong. I think that people who are truly thinking queerly in theology have quite a challenge on their hands. So in order to address my title, which is Christianity, Queer Pasts, Queer Futures, ? I hope to present a somewhat destabilised Christian past in order to move towards a totally unstable, open and challenging Christian future. We'll have to see. So to begin, I have to understand what I believe Christianity to be. This may shed some light on how I read the past and how I move within the future I think possible. My understanding, of course, is indebted to my feminist sisters, many of whom are here this evening. Christianity is rooted in the belief, of course, that the life and death of Jesus was redemptive. It is significant for all time and for all people. Further, that the life of Jesus allows for the creation of doctrine and ethics that will also stand for all time. But I think that many need to believe this, and they need to believe that nothing changes, that all of this is static, and that there is a truth right from the beginning. But of course, as many theologians have shown us, an honest look at church history shows that everything changes, with what was once orthodox becoming now heresy, and so on. Feminist theology has engaged in this ongoing conversation with Christian orthodoxy, and has, I believe, become very adept at developing reading strategies using feminist theory, post-colonialism, and many postmodernist stances, which challenge theology still rooted in and interpreted through the lens of Greek philosophy. These alternative strategies have enabled women's lived experience, as we heard from Anne, to be the basis of the creation of theology. It's allowed meaning to emerge, but I think most importantly for this engagement with queer theology, it has also highlighted the gaps. That's to say that every inch in breathing space hasn't been filled. Feminist theology has left a number of very untidy edges, which it's very happy to live with, since it doesn't believe that the divine suffers from an obsessive compulsion to control. After all, I would think that a God who incarnates in flesh and blood surely can't believe that everything will be the way it was. So I understand Christianity as a story rooted in incarnation, but an incarnation that is erotic, sensuous, and powerful. One that's always urging us forward to relationality and flourishing. It is for me, then, the glorious abandonment of the divine into flesh, and the passionate dance of the human divine that ensues. Incarnation, I believe, tells us that our bodies are our homes, that is to say, our divine human dwelling places. Therefore, our journey is home, but home to the fullness of our own incarnation. Perhaps we could argue, and I'm going to try, that theology that has incarnation at its heart is queer. What else so fundamentally changes the nature of human and divine identity? That the divine immersed itself in flesh, and that flesh is now divine. God became man in order that man might become God, which we all too often hear, but I don't have that particular interpretation in mind, is perhaps queer theology. There can't be any sanitization here, or something of the divine will be lost. Therefore, the theology that this assumes is not one of denial and narrow boundaries, it's one of embrace and expansion, one that willfully wishes to move the edges of the world in which we live. Joan Casalis reminded us that those who made an opening in ruptured existing reality, wanted others to make it bigger. In other words, the power that we see in the life of Jesus is the power we are asked to embrace in order to continue a bursting forth of the divine in the everyday life. I think this view of incarnation creatively and empoweringly collapses dualisms and declares Christianity to be a skin trade, a face-to-face mutual engagement, human to human divine, and even human to non-human divine. This doesn't assume static Christians. After all, in the prologue of St. John, we hear that the incarnate was the one that pitched its tent, a movable feast, one fit for walking, one that expands and changes shape in the winds of change. It's this incarnation that Christians have been told is the divine in community, the divine in society. So this kind of understanding of incarnation can't project any abjects or consume difference. Rather, it should be one that is open to change and really willing to take up the adventure of expanding incarnation. I think it's becoming clear then that for me, Christianity is about flesh and blood reality in people's lives as co-creators. So it follows then that all manner of embodiment and embodied experience is further unfolding the divine human reality that we live. Of course, this understanding of Christianity has made me very suspicious when I hear the word normal. I don't know what normal is, because I've never met a normal person. It seems that norms are easy conveniences for those who like surveys and statistics, but they're not for those who are lovers of the divine in flesh. But in rejecting Christian norms, the question comes, are we rejecting truths that are embedded in Christianity that cannot change, or are we simply looking at truths that may be uncovered, rediscovered, or invented as some reusable and creative Christian past? At this point, I'd like to give an example of how I attempted to rethink one particular woman in the history, how in that attempt she changed from norm through feminist readings to queer. And this might be a helpful way for us to start our possible quest for a possible queer past. There's a strong body of evidence, I'm sure we're all aware, that suggests that the stories in the apocryphal Acts, many of which are about women, are folk tales, and as such they claim to present history. Folk tales, we are told, serve two opposing purposes. They stabilise society, and at the same time, they make it unstable. We should tell more of them. They can define the identity of those who are dissatisfied with society, and they can become a sense of strength for that group. What we find then in many of these Christian stories are women who defy physical boundaries and, in my view then, question gender and sexual roles. Tekla, and one's students, yes, they followed back, is studying Tekla. Tekla I find quite interesting. She's a woman who was empowered to spread the gospel, and in the early days of LGBTI theology, she was hailed as transvestite, transgendered, and so on. But with a queer eye, I wonder if this motif of cross-dressing was used to tell something else about the relationship of people who became Christians with their gendered environment. Contemporary scholarship is no longer content to leave the argument that she and other cross-dressers dressed so for safety. After all, in Tekla's story, she doesn't cross-dress from the beginning, even though she's travelling and at some risk. She only cross-dresses after baptism. John Anson has argued that in cross-dressing, women such as Tekla were simply putting on a male form of Christ. But I think there's perhaps another reading, that what she was doing was embracing the wholeness of God, clothed in the full gender richness of divine reality. I wish to argue that she understood her male attire as connected to overcoming the binary opposites of gender that set in place unequal lived reality. Cross-dressing implies a starting point and a place towards which one is aiming, and so serves to highlight gender polarity, since clothes allow us to play with identity, and they aid that becoming. They enable a physical, embodied performance. Cross-dressing creates an illusion for the user and the observer, or as Van Gelig puts it, it is a liminal space, allowing movement across boundaries and transversing margins which confine. It's an ingenious tool because it doesn't fit categories of sex or gender alone, and as such exposes both of these, both sex and gender, and is a form, again, that Van Gelig calls of gender iconography. It makes visible spaces of possibility, which are closed off by these sort of static and rigid forms of behaving as gendered and sexualized people. Ritual cross-dressing predated Christian cross-dressing and has at its heart the notion of returning to wholeness, believing it allows a very deep experience of gender, both of one's own and of others. In some societies, early societies, it represented magical qualities, which is signalled mainly by its ambiguity. So there is a cultural heritage there in Christian cross-dressing, and it takes seriously this equality that the Christian gospel says it's looking for. Were these women, I wonder, in some way, living a radical equality through this particular performance? Were they questioning what had been put in place? And is it true that once we engage in confusing these categories, it leads to their breakdown as oppositional points of reference? Of course, if it is true, then we would need to ensure that they don't replace along some sort of axis the old points of reference. I'm wondering, or I found myself wondering, if the categories were simply being confused or were they being erased. My colleague Liz Stewart argued that the central sacrament of the Christian Church is the Eucharist, stands as an embodied practice suggesting erasure of gender and sex. It takes both, she claims, to a symbolic level and displaces them. By this sacramental enactment, we move through a range of identities, all of which become unstable and finally erased. I embrace the notion of unstable identities, but I do find I have difficulty with the idea of moving to a symbolic realm before total erasure. This makes primarily my feminist heart sink, because the symbolic world, which for Stewart is metaphysical, has done no favours to any of us. It's a world in which Lacan tells us women, and of course I would suggest even queers, whatever that is, have no place, since the symbolic is wholly and purely traditionally male, and conveyed through language and culture, which according to him necessarily excludes anything that's not male. Why then, I wonder, would we see this symbolic realm as a powerful dwelling place for anyone who doesn't fit or doesn't wish to fit a fixed identity. Irigaray highlights this dilemma by suggesting that there can be no subjectivity until women find a place in culture, since this belonging gives psychic leverage to personhood. For her, this can only begin with the body. Braidotti acknowledges also that bodies can be radically subverting of culture when they find their voice beyond the fixed language and meaning of the master discourses. This, she suggests, is to engage in a politics of positioning, to find new ways of being by thinking through the body. Although these women were speaking about women, the queerness of their suggestions can be seen, and does raise a question for me about a voice within fluid and boundary-pushing identities. Do we just have one voice, or multiple voices with multiple subjectivities? A question I don't have an answer to at the moment, but hope to engage with through somatic psychology and what it offers in terms of bodily presenting and psychological responses to these presentations. This investigation, I think, will also bring up questions of culture and subjectivity within these new dialogues. Don't know, I haven't been there yet. It's just a feeling. So, for now, let's move on with Braidotti, who speaks of figurations which are politically informed accounts of alternate subjectivity, the living as if. And this is a technique, a strategy of relocation, in order to rescue what we need of the past, in order to trace paths of transformation of our lives here and now. She continues, as if is affirmation of fluid boundaries, practices of intervals. Neither of these see an end. There's no end to be found in either of them. Not even, and in fact particularly not, the symbolic order. For this reason then, perhaps we need to be nomads, taking no position or identity as permanent, but rather trespassing and transgressing, making coalitions and interconnections beyond boxes. The nomadism of which Braidotti speaks perhaps enables theologians to pick up the notion of Christians as resurrection and pilgrim people, especially in the light of our nomadic cross-dressing four sisters. Should we take seriously the possibility of shifting and moving within gender and sexual identities that could free us from the oppressive repetitions required by religion, politics, economics and culture? Perhaps by highlighting the constructed nature of gender categories, we begin to draw attention to their foolishness and their restrictive natures, and begin to enflesh the baptismal formula in Christ as neither male nor female. Is this a Christian politics of positioning, and can it be argued that it's the very nature of incarnation itself, shifting, moving and permeable? It's not just these apocryphal acts in which we find Christians being at home in interesting gender and sexual enactments. Richard Rambos, I'm sure you know his work, has undertaken research in the area of erotic desire and the sacred within Christian history. And what he's uncovered is the way in which the sacred erotic transgresses the boundaries of all kinds of vanilla heterosexuality, that form of sexuality that is paradoxically upheld with such vigour by Christian morality and underpinned by Christian understandings of gender. Reading Rambos, we may agree with Michael Warner, who says, religion makes available a language of ecstasy, a horizon of significance within which transgressions against the norm, the normal order of the world, and the boundaries of self can be seen as good things. Is this language of ecstasy, then, a linguistic sight, as Braidotti would call it, a mother tongue through which queers may begin to see differently? Rambos, I love reading Rambos. I do it over and over again, because he takes us on this magical mystery tour of kind of religious devotion and what people got up to. And it's really very interesting, because you have bodies that are fully eroticized through the desire that they have for worshipping various forms of the divine, and for, well, as we'll see later, for that form of divine almost worshipping them. Christ is always changeable in these devotions, never fixed in gender, sex or sexuality, And in fact, that's not just the Christ image that's not, but it's the people themselves who then cross through all kinds of categories. Catherine of Siena marries Christ, and Christ changes genders for Catherine. So Christ becomes female, and Catherine is sinking into this flesh of a female Christ. She's just one example. There are many writings and artworks that show that the body of Christ is fluid and at times appearing as physically female. In the sonnets of John Donne, he implores God to ravish him, to batter him, to take him, to break him, to imprison him. There appears to be rape fantasies, there appears to be bondage, there appears to be many different kinds of sexual acts going on between John Donne and God, all of which are homosexual rape fantasies, bondage fantasies, and so on. So Rambus wonders whether in the work of Donne we see that redemption is sodomized or that sodomy has a place in redemption. Either way, this religious and pious outpouring moves us beyond the edges of conventional morality. Similar theme is carried on in the work of Trahan, who in a poem entitled Love imagines himself drenched in and impregnated by Christ's sweet stream. He goes on to say he offers himself to Christ as his Ganymede, whereupon Christ comes down to him and takes him up as his boy. Rambus insists that closet devotion is the technology by which the soul becomes a subject, a space in which the sacred may touch the transgressive and even the profane. I think in these brief examples, I mean there are many, many more, but the time does not allow. So in the brief examples, we see a broader picture of Christian devotion than many would expect. But is this queer theology? Because actually, in many of these cases, what's happening is simply a crossing of gender that is still within its binary oppositions. There is one woman who I love dearly in our history who doesn't accept binary distinctions. This is Marjorie Kemp. She places before us the embodiment of moving beyond otherness, and who more than most illuminates Hayward's assertion that our sensuality is the foundation of our authority. She may be the place where we find a slightly queerer perspective. She's a very good example of how the fullness of eroticism, triggered by an object of desire, can lead to transgressive fullness within the sacred. Marjorie gets married to God. This is the Godhead who is Father, Son and Spirit, all of whom should be understood as female in the mind of Marjorie. There's an important addition to this Godhead, and that's Marjorie. She's in there. So she's marrying herself. And we're told that God is declaring, you're in me, and I am in you, we're all in her. So is this some sort of first queer move through this intimacy? The distance that is so often expected in Christian theology between God and the person in order to inspire devotion just simply isn't there when Marjorie is being devoted to and worshipping God. There aren't any end points in God. God is expanded through Marjorie, and Marjorie through God. This is a very extraordinary marriage. All kinds of boundaries are crossed and opened up with all kinds of possibilities. She has very passionate sex with God, who is both her child and her lover. Jesus is her husband and her son, and the Godhead always remains female. Everything in the devotions of Marjorie Kemp, everything is thrown into disarray. And what emerges is a relationality based on radical subjectivity, through which Marjorie herself becomes bigger as God becomes bigger. This vision of being wedded to and an integral part of the Godhead enables her to experience her edges as expanded, but at the same time she moves around this kind of core of erotic self-discovery. So again, it's very odd that she's getting bigger at the same time that she's focusing in. And the oddest thing, perhaps, is that Father, Son and Spirit all experience their divinity through Marjorie. in her visions that's very important. They don't have divinity without experiencing it through Marjorie. Their subjectivity is heightened, and the more that this happens, the more, as I've said, hers is heightened. All of their identities become nomadic, but it isn't a mere sort of gender performance, because Father, Son, Spirit all become interchangeable. But more than this, they go beyond gender categories. They're all interchangeable into the animal, mineral, ether, bread, wine, presence and absence, and so much more. In her devotion, in her visions, we could say, there is a subjectivity with no edges, but a subjectivity, as I've mentioned, for the divine that is created through her, but then finds that it has no edges. It's a contradiction, and the boundarylessness, I always find that very difficult to say, that gives meaning, but actually fixes nothing. Marjorie is released into a fuller life, and she expands the edges of theology, I think, by the way she understands this devotion with God. Reflecting on her life, I began to speculate that while we allow continued gender enactment and stable and equal categories to be played out on our bodies, then perhaps we are not open enough to the surprising wonder of incarnation. I hope I've made some sort of case for there being a kind of queer history that we all, or is it that all we have here are some queer people, some queer things happening in Christian history rather than a queer Christianity? Graham Ward would claim that the gospel itself tells queer stories, in the sense that what we have conveyed involves a number of queer moves and displacements. Ward argues that from the outset the male body of Jesus is peculiar, because it springs, to start with, from the body of a woman, and so if it had been parthenogenesis it would have been female. But as it wasn't, the story tells us that we are faced with kind of unstable materiality. And so right from the start, he claims, materiality is becoming metaphorical, and that this is expanded throughout the Gospel accounts, where this man walks on water, is transfigured, ascends bodily into heaven, and is said to be present in the breaking of bread. In each of these scenarios, the body is displaced, and according to Ward, the sex body becomes problematic and eroticized. He suggests that the gendered body of Jesus is malleable and capable of transposition, and that the Gospels chant this course of increasing destabilization and many transformations. Each of these makes manifest more of the divine. And this is an important point to note, because Ward is saying that it's not the gendered body that demonstrates anything, but it is materiality that demonstrates how boundaries can be pushed. He challenges, therefore, the corporal, material nature, saying that the Gospels themselves proclaim there are no limits to this. And he too starts from a place of radical incarnation, so he's saying there are no limits to our physicality, our materiality as well. He points out that there's much devotional art that follows a queer road, particularly Renaissance art, where we see the Christ child is both baby and spouse. He inseminates his own mother, which is quite peculiar. In pictures of the Ascension, we notice that Christ has his penis fondled by God, and that God also penetrates his own son. Art historians tell us, and it's art historians, not theologians, who tell us that this signals the completion of salvation for humanity. I think we can only find this interesting. I can only find it interesting. What we do know is that all this artwork is based on theology of the time, and so seems to signal a set of displacements of what we might call the human divine norm. I hope there is a case that Christian history itself and the Gospels perhaps have this queer nature to them. But what about doctrine? Doctrine is the thing that people die for and people get killed for. So it's perhaps a little more difficult to start working with it. But my dear friend Marcella Otters-Reid was brave enough to do so. And she puts forward the understanding of a Christ who is not, as she called it, the Christ of fetish of Christianity, but rather she develops the notion of the bi-Christ. This is a figure who isn't bi in terms of sexual preference, but rather in terms of thought and life. This is a fluid Christ, one full of contradictions, and one that destabilizes everything. And she personally found that absolutely crucial. She argued also that the bi-Christ, as Ward had argued before about other things, is a gospel image. Because on the one hand you've got the Prince of Peace, on the other hand you have this man whipping people out of the temple. So there again you have this man talking to the woman at the well and being very sympathetic, but he cannot change, does not seem very interested in changing really impurity laws regarding women. She says that the mistake that theology has made is by trying to harmonise these points of difference. What you need to do is to take them, in a sense, as read and embrace them as fluid movements of incarnation. If you take the evidence before you and ask the challenging questions, you allow the false harmonising to be stripped away and a new and exciting rupture, as she called it, to emerge. What she's suggesting is a Christ who is beyond hetero. She doesn't mean this necessarily in sexual terms. She means that this is beyond the Christ of power over and hierarchies, beyond the Christ of dualism. This is a Christ who is of liberation, who liberates both the poor and the rich, and who moves structures of oppression, but not into one unified and harmonious liberation, which is, I think, very important. That was one of her criticisms of feminist and liberation theology, that there seemed to be this sort of utopian vision for all. And she was saying, no, the bi-Christ challenges even that. The bi-Christ overcomes mono-relations that has an impact on sexuality, certainly, but also has an impact in politics and the way we understand and colonise the experience of others, particularly those who don't look anything like us. So she used the colonisation of Africa as an example. She pointed out that the relationship under this one mono-heavenly God and Father could never be equal. That kind of idea of God is never flexible enough. All this creates, in her view, is the exclusion of otherness. This means that the needs, the desires of others don't enter any conversation whatsoever. That all gets replaced and pushed aside with exploitation and subjugation. She argued that the bi-Christ dismantles modern relations, those that give themselves the power to name, organise and exploit. The bi-Christ for her allowed other ways to think. It used the lived experience of people, and in her case, women and girls, in the creation of what she calls an indecent theology, one based in the pleasures and pains of female sexuality. This has led many to ask if there is some form of essentialism here that clashes with queer understandings of sex and gender. Well, I was mentioning earlier on that we had many conversations in large leather chairs with lots of whiskey. And so the answer became, well, yes and no, as only, a whiskey-fueled conversation can be. Yes, of course, she has got some essentialism going on here. But no, because what she was trying to overcome really was this romanticised and sterilised form of women's lives that often she thought feminist theology put forward. She's trying to say there's another picture. We have to move into indecent theology and queer theology. Indecent then because we're not looking simply at the nice experiences, the holy experiences in the creation of our doctrine. And queer because in examining real lives, categories just will not do. Boxes are just too small, and all kinds of crossing over becomes necessary in order to grasp something of the reality we experience within and between us. I'm still left wondering, is the by Christ queer enough? Yes, we can say that we can hold on to the not either or of its construction, and that it is a huge step forward. But is it queer enough? I don't know. I'll let you decide on that. I'm not going to go great deal into queer readings of Scripture, because we all know that there's been a lot of that, and you've probably read it all yourselves. But I do have sort of quite a favourite reading by Ken Stone of Jeremiah, who he sees as a sassy bottom, and who gives his daddy a very hard time. This is Marie, wasn't it? This is a reading that he takes from life, but he also feels sheds a great new light on the divine-human relation within ourselves, let alone between us all. All I would want to say in terms of queer theology and Scripture is that as canons of Scripture were simply communities saying what they thought about God, and that the truth of Scripture hangs on that perhaps alone, isn't it time then for queer myth-making that becomes sacred Scripture? Perhaps this is both needed and legitimate. Perhaps we need to move now as a next step, if we're talking about the queer future, from reading the Scriptures we have into creating Scriptures that are speaking queer reality, and that in some way they hold communities in the same way, and that perhaps practices of sex, gender, economics, ecology, etc., race, will come from these new myth-making, these new stories. I think we can say there is a fluid, rupturing core in Christianity. I hope we can. A queerness that begs to be embraced. Why then, is the big question, does the church and theology, even theology, grind on in the repetition of endless binary thinking? This brings me to the biggest challenge that the multiplicity of queer theology offers both myself and, I think, Christianity. Perhaps Sarah Grace sums it up neatly when she says, one betrays one's naivety if one considers our modern societies to be simply patrilinear or capitalist, and ignores the fact that they are at the same time governed by monotheism. Have we theologians then been naive if we think we can keep monotheistic thinking, however much we might sort of tweak with the edges of that, which has underpinned so many of the damaging elements in our heritage, and at the same time engage fully with incarnation and its demands, requirements, requests for some sort of queer living? Laurel Schneider, I'm sure you know, has engaged with this logic of the one, this question, and she says there can be no room for multiplicity if we cling to this notion of the one. For her then the choice is very, very clear. Do we settle for the world of categories and abstractions that the one presents us with, or do we embrace what she calls the multiplicity? And this is the diverse nature of embodiment. An embodiment that refuses categories, because bodies don't tend to come in rigid categories, or with certain identity marks upon them, or ways of being in the world. She points out that a fundamental goal of love and peace can't be satisfied under the regime of the one. She writes a great deal about that may or may not be relevant today with the political situations we find ourselves in. She suggests that love always needs more than one. It has to have encounter or it can't be ethical. It has to recognise the presence of others, all kinds of others, as they are. So oneness, this absolute oneness, perhaps has to be moved. If it's not moved, is all relation lost? Is all possibility of loving and being loved lost? She would say it is, and that she feels that the only thing we can say about incarnation is that it's risky and it shows up. And I think that's lovely. None of this big theological chat is just risky, and it shows up. And it's a posture of openness when it shows up. So it wants this kind of, as she calls it, loving, discordant, plenipotential world that is much more than colonizing desire, and saming everything, bringing everything within this kind of realm of this one. She's of course not alone in this desire, as we've seen Marcella tried to move towards this, and in my own work I've tried for quite some time to do that from my incarnational standpoint. I've been pushing at these categories via notions of radical incarnation, talking about, as I did at the beginning, the abandonment of the divine into flesh that puts all aspects, including the transcendent, within and especially between people. And I would now like to also add to that, not just people, the whole of the created order. So even the transcendent can't stay out there somewhere. It has to be something that is between and within. So in what ways then can queer theologians shift the concept of monotheism in order to open up to the next step in our journey? If we think we need to do this, I personally think we do. Catherine Keller, although I think not a queer theologian, is very useful in the struggle, because she enables us to move from monotheism by her investigation of the deep, which she says is the ground of who we are, but crucially, it's not a fixed identity. It's not this kind of, inner core or something. It's not a fixed identity relying on one. It's a deep situated in the cosmos. This is the thing that gives the lie to creation out of nothing and opens before us a God who is intimate and of infinite entanglements. She visits Paul's writings in 1 Corinthians on the body of Christ and reminds us that in the Greek we are told that all is all. But the Greek actually means all in all. So there's no difference between anything or between everything and God. All is all. For Keller, this disables any theology of distance and separation. Nor is the divine, under her understanding, simply androcentric then. For her, the Bible itself is eco-centric. That this idea that whatever God the divine is, it's not a mono God sitting somewhere away. It is a reality that's in everything. This energy is not something we have, it's something we are. And it's the same energy that gives life to everything. It's the stuff of entanglements. Val Plumwood would even say, bless her, that it's even the stuff of rocks and stones. It's not just the stuff of other sort of living, breathing creatures. It's the stuff of everything. Keller places our whole being into this kind of cosmic, this universe, this earthly interaction. And she says this is the energy of eternal delight. This is our desire. This is our energy. This is our divine. And that if we deny this through narrow doctrine, narrow understandings of the world, then the end of all of that is that we become depressed and we find we have no meaning. Well, I find a lot of young people who are both depressed and feel they have no meaning, and some of those are in churches, others are out of churches, but it's this kind of closing down. Keller wants to throw us back to these cosmic beginnings, to void and chaos, to understand who we are, not in some sort of wonderful light shining on us from the divine, but actually in the darkness, that our becoming, our being is veiled in darkness. And she says once we give energy to this void and chaos, then we do away with this mono, this voice that comes from nowhere, this commanding Lord who creates everything and dictates everything. And she would rather talk about a whisper of desire, that in the pages of Genesis, let there be, is a whisper of desire that brings everything forth. I think that's really important. I've not had the opportunity to talk to her about what she actually means by that, but my own take on it would be that it's not, it isn't calling forth by something else. This let it be is almost the breath of that energy that is all in all, that it's something we're all saying, not just from the beginning, not just with the first bits of life, but that all of us are calling forth ourselves with a let it be or a let there be, and each other in sort of the same way, rather than this being some external voice. Still, whatever, with Keller's move, we're moving from above to within. And her shift, I think, is very important, because it means that incarnation emerges from chaos, and that it is the rule in the whole of creation, not the exception. So this, I think, gives the notion of incarnation something more of a kind of, if it's in chaos, it's not stable, it's not a fixing agent, as the kind of Christ of tradition has been. It places all things within this turmoil. Now, for me, this seems to be the nub, one of the nubs, maybe, of the future of queer theology. What do we do with this ultimate edge, this end point, this unchanging, powerful God, within a form of theology that's always moving beyond, expanding, displacing, unsettling? Laurel Schneider is quite clear that we have to get rid of it. It's got to go. No monotheistic eschatological fantasies, the end of all difference and the truth of God, she says, which I think is a lovely phrase. We have to move away from it. To find a truly queer theology, then, I think we do have to tackle the mono-divine in our traditions as the next step. It's a very difficult one. I hope to be exploring it through further engagement with multiplicity of human experience, particularly with those said to be at the margins, and through understandings of our divine humanness as not ending at the edges of our skin, but being intrinsically entangled in the chaos and endless possibilities of cosmic spiraling. It is my fervent hope that queer theory aids theology in the task of moving from metaphysics to metamorphing, but not for the sake of it, but in order that more space may be made for the glorious and diverse divine to dance and to be celebrated. My word of caution, though, would be that we shouldn't believe the word queer, any more than any other words we've come up with before theology, is the label that solves all problems. I don't believe it is. Perhaps this is only my feminist heart beating, but I think we should always be mindful that even with flexible, boundary-pushing words, it can always hide many political issues that still exist around all these things that we know, race, economics, gender, on and on and on. J. Johnson, who I'm reading at the moment, has noted that even when he tries to write from a queer perspective, he is, at the end of the day, a white, privileged male who can, in large part, avoid most of the unpleasant actions that may happen in terms of sort of queers in the world. So he writes that way, but he knows he's protected. I've got another concern as well. These identity politics of my youth. I'm still very taken with them. I have soft spots for them. And it prompts me to ask the question that by destabilising all identity, do we lose some political clout that group identity carried with it? My hope is, though, that queer cosmic theologies will move us beyond that particular set of labels into a more embedded sense of being, but a sense of being that's built on volatile ruptures and earthquakes. There's nothing stable. So how do I propose to queerly continue? Well, in the risk of incarnation with and in bodies touching those of others, themselves, animate and inanimate, and the cosmos, within glorious risking, within unfolding, flaring, spiralling unfoldings of endless questions, possibilities, and entanglements. And most of all, in moments of touch and recognition. that are fleeting but give us some insight. So thank you very much on this hot evening for sitting and listening, and thank you all for coming. Yeah, of course. I can't dance a little bit. Happy to hear that.
Well, this has been a very profound and searching experience to be posed with all these questions that you've brought to us. Very fruitful, very generative. And so, could we share?
Yeah.
That's you.
Yes.
So would you like to just go ahead and reveal your...
Yes, certainly.
Okay.
Quite happy for you to say I didn't believe a word of it. I should stay at home. That's okay. Yes.
Okay, so an observation and two short questions. One is that in this search for the queer past of Christianity, I added, you haven't already considered, foolishness for Christ, holy fools, like St. Simeon and, people who mocked deacons by wearing stoles made of sausages outside the church and eating them as they processed into the church. Holy fools pushing the boundaries of the socially acceptable through radically sarcastic behavior. And then a couple of questions. In this search, which is really a search, I think, for good metaphors, really, for speaking of God and speaking of the divine, in the divine's actions, in incarnation and the experience of the divine, I think is the metaphor of play in the radically multiple expressions of God. I think is it a useful metaphor, do you think, for this multiplicity and radically non-stable and intentionally opposites that are intentionally unable to be collapsed and smoothed over? Is that a fine metaphor? And then speaking of sexuality as part of this conversation and trying to engage the multiplicities of the incarnated experiences, is sexuality and our sexual relationships as a field of thought not universal enough because of the fact of sexuality in all of its forms, not in fact as in our multiple ways of seeing it, experienced by all human beings. I think of the upcoming and emerging asexual community. Is sexuality as a metaphor for divine interaction a not universal enough metaphor? So those are my...
I'll start with that one. I think asexuality is a form of sexuality, if that makes any sense. And I hope that sort of queer investigations will never see themselves as being universal. But it's certainly, I find a place to start because Christianity has been so negative about it. So I think it's a good place. And I would hope that this sort of asexual movement starts to reflect on what that means and how that might be about incarnation or so on. But I do think that's also a form of sexuality. Yes, I would like to have more conversations around that, but I don't think it sits outside. And again, it depends if you take a sort of Freudian kind of stance. And I think Hayward sort of in a strange way kind of did this, that sexuality is sort of everything. She would say sexuality was going for a walk with a dog, drinking good coffee. That's in a broad sense. So I think there's sort of two answers to that, which may or may not be satisfactory. I certainly think that play is absolutely essential, because not only are we encouraged to play with gender consciously, but I think, play is so creative. We know this when we watch it in children, and what happens with adults is we often forget to play with who we might be, and you can't see me, I'm a tree. Okay, kids believe they're a tree and you can't see them. And that's a kind of Marjorie Camp boundary crossing, isn't it, a way? Not for us to say, don't be silly. A psych friend of mine said when people sit in front of her and they say, I'm a rock crystal, She doesn't tell them to leave. She said, well, it's so interesting. What's it like to be a rock Christian? In a sense, she's taking that really seriously, because that is where they are in their identity at the moment. And I think that is part of, I always say to her, you're a queer psychologist. She said, I'm not, I'm a Jungian. But in a sense, it is, because she's taking every experience that she's presented with as, okay, that's your experience. What's it telling you? If you're a spiritually inclined person, what's it telling you about that? And so I think this sense of play is really, really important, and not something that we should put boundaries around. Not that we should say, you can play in this area, but you can't play in this. Economics and politics are not places for play. Well, they might be, not to end up with anybody dying as a result of it, but, the creation for thinking differently and within our body. I mean, play is within our body and it's between people. And I do think it could be a very useful thing for politicians to do. I mean, at our university, they're encouraging us to play with dogs. So they're bringing dogs on the campus for us to play with. And I don't know whether that's a good idea or a bad idea, but I'll tell you when I see you next. But, I mean, in a sense, it's sort of an interesting idea. Once you get over it, you have got to be kidding. It's quite an interesting idea, because, it's a different space for academics to put themselves in. I'm going into this room and I'll play with this dog and see what happens. Yeah. But yes, I think it's very important. Lot of verbals for short answers, sorry. Yeah.
So as you were referencing the art of Margaret Smith and talking about destabilizing notions of monotheism and getting rid of traditional eschatological pictures, I couldn't, or hopes I should say, I couldn't help but think of Ludwig Feuerbach's earlier Essence of Christianity, right, where ultimately theology becomes anthropology. And I'm wondering if someone could interpret what you provided us tonight with that type of Feuerbach thinking. Are you seeing that with that type of, ultimately you peel off all the layers of theology and you really get anthropology. Are you seeing that with that type of interpretation of your work? Or?
Yes, absolutely, why not? Because for me, and of course this is just for me, anthropology is a form, of course it's a form of incarnational thinking, because it's about the layers of us, the layers of everything else, and from where I'm starting, it's a form of incarnational thinking, so I see no reason why not. I'm not sure sort of what the results would be, of course, but I think it would be a very interesting exercise to say when all of this is kind of stripped away, where are we, what happens, and again, not to fix that. I mean, that would be my only concern, that if we're saying we're stripping everything and we're now down to the very basic and this is it, I would think that would be, an end point, and I'm struggling with end points, kind of in my personal life and the lives of other people I see. I realise that some of those are important at times, but in theoretical thinking and the idea of the monogod and so on, that kind of thing, I think it's important to get away from all of that. So there's big contradiction going on in me, but I would say theoretically anything that gets to the point that says it's the end point, I would be concerned about. I don't know if it answers the question. Marie.
One thing you didn't address, but I think it is part of your work, is part of the ultimate edge, I think, for queer theology, as you put it, is the idea that often queer people feel that that's an edge that they would rather not approach at all because it's been so inhospitable to them. The house of religion and theology hasn't been a house that's had a place at them at the table. So part of this ultimate edge is to find that there's something useful for us here as queer people. And I was interested in your idea of, as we move from metaphysics into morphing, that this embedded sense of being, you said you don't want it to be embedded in this solid structure, but this volcanic, like earthquake type structure. And do you see how can queer theology, I mean, I'm doing queer theology, as you know, since you edited the book, but how does this help? What is this ultimate edge for queer people? What does queer theology offer us as queer people? Because I often find, like in my own life, outside of a school of religion, in queer discourse, outside of religion, queer people will say, oh, you did why is your work in religion? Why did you interview 100 gay people and you're putting it in a book about religion? I hate religion. How can you like religion? You know, what, like, sort of, you're almost posited as being stupid if you, as a queer person, if you're in religion.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
Like, why aren't you in cultural studies? I mean, not dissing cultural studies or any other field. I said, for me, I've always said religion is too important to leave in the hands of straight people and not But since religion has done so much damage to queer people, that I feel like, but I'm interested in the way you think this is an ultimate edge, and how do we enter that as queer people?
Yeah, I think monotheism is one of the ultimate edges that we have to try and get over. I'm sorry if it came over that I think kind of queer theology is an ultimate edge. I don't. I hope it's not. I hope there's something beyond that. But coming to this question of, religion has not done queer people any good at all. Of course not. And there would be two ways I think I would want to address that. One, to say those religious people need to hear that there is perhaps a very queer call to Christianity. It's not the way they think it has been. There is another interpretation other than the one they think is the only one. So I think that's quite important, just to sort of destabilise that understanding. Religion, it depends what you mean. If you mean the practice of religions in places, I think that can be very destructive, very hurtful. But if it's about engaging with the discourse and expanding the discourse and making sense somehow, broadening it, going to those edges and making them edgier and saying, but this is still the stuff of incarnation, this is still the stuff of religion, I think that's really a really important thing to do. And so, yes, of course, I mean, so many times I've heard from so many people that, you have to be mad to be involved in theology if you're even talking about queer theory, let alone if you're living queer life. But I don't really agree, because I think that whole discourse needs expanding, because how I've understood religion is how we make sense of ourselves in the world, not actually about any ultimate divine. So why should queer people not enter into that conversation about sense of ourselves in the world? I think it's an important conversation to enter into, and in a sense, I would say, kind of established religions will come along with the conversation or just die out. Because that seems to be what's happening in the UK anyway. That religion is dying out. I mean, it never started from a very strong position, as Ruth reminded me earlier. Said, you Brits don't really do religion, do you? It's not a strong position. We export it to colonise people, but we don't practice it. So about 12% of people say they practice Christianity. So I don't know if that actually gets to the question you asked, but yeah. Okay.
Let me take a big shot of this. Definitions. When you use the word queer, is it synonymous with homosexuality, gay, broader, more confining? What?
Yeah,
play with that a little bit.
I mean, dear Marcella, when she was talking just about LGBT alphabet questions, used to say, well, yeah, let's add heterosexuals in there. Heterosexuals need to come out. Heterosexuals need to talk about the complexity of their heterosexuality. It's not one thing. So I think this is where sort of queer comes into that as well. That let's talk about those edges, of all lives, of every life. And I mean, there have been some scholars who even tried sort of queer cosmology, which is quite interesting. What does that mean? So no, it's not just confined. It's not just for gay, lesbian people. It's for everybody, every persuasion. And in fact, in a sense, I think it signals the non-static definitions of those things. That heterosexual, even though it likes to think it is a stable category, is not a stable category. It's only, as Marcella's work points out, a stable category for colonizing experience. In itself, it's not a stable category. It doesn't signal one thing.
Yeah. Thank you. I want to thank you for such a
I want to thank you.
challenging, exciting evening.
I want to thank you for making me think.
It's been good for us to teach you.
Oh, thank you. You could have said nice. No, I'll go queerly home. Whatever that means.